Welcome to a pair of bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. We are your hosts and hopefully your new bookish pals. I'm Hannah MacDonald.
And I'm Lydia Clare. We are so excited to share another episode in our debut Spotlight series, where we highlight a debut author we want to place firmly on your radar. Today's spotlight is shining on the excellent debut author, Victoria MacKenzie, and their novel, For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain.
Victoria MacKenzie is a fiction writer and poet. Her writing has won numerous awards, including a Scottish Book Trust New Writers Award, the inaugural Emerging Writer Award from Moniac Moore, and was shortlisted for the Lucy Cavendish Fiction Prize. She's been awarded prestigious writing residencies in Scotland, Finland, and Australia, and currently teaches creative writing. We also hear through the grapevine that a second novel is already in the pipeline. Victoria, welcome to A Pair of Bookends.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
So what we always love to start with, well, I say we, it's mainly me, isn't it, Hannah? I'm sorry.
Pretty much.
Let's just face it, it's just my nosiness. But we would love to know, what are you currently reading?
Sure. So I am currently reading The Pharmacist by Rochelle Atala. She is based in Glasgow and it's her debut novel that came out last year. So it's kind of speculative. It's set in a bunker. There's this group of people in there. I'm only a few chapters in, so I can't give any spoilers because I don't know what's going to happen. But one of the main characters who is telling the story is a pharmacist. She's down there sort of dispensing, meeting with everyone pretty much that lives in the bunker. We don't know why they're in a bunker. We're sort of assuming that maybe there's been some kind of nuclear incident, but it's absolutely fantastic premise for a novel because you've got a really diverse bunch of people in this very claustrophobic, strange setting. So it's really character driven and interesting.
That sounds right up my street.
Yeah. Rochelle's brilliant. It was Sunday Times paperback of the week, I think, recently, and it was also shortlisted for Scotland's Fiction Book of the Year. So
amazing.
Really enjoying it.
Ooh,
I am ordering that straight away.
I know, it's just another one to my list.
Sounds so good. So Victoria, as this is a series dedicated to debut authors, we'd love to find out what your journey has been like, and have you always been a writer?
So my journey's been pretty convoluted. So I've been writing for about 20 years. I'm in my early 40s. So I've been writing about 20 years. But I actually wanted to be a poet when I first started. So I did some creative writing classes. I moved from Brighton to Scotland to study at St Andrews and did a master's in creative writing when I was in my late 20s, and that was poetry. And then I did a PhD, and that was poetry. And at some point along the line, I got thoroughly sick of poetry. So I started to write fiction. I started off with short stories. It wasn't until my mid-30s that I actually started to think about writing a novel. I think the length of novels was really daunting. And then I started to write Brantwood, which is a novel about the Victorian art critic John Ruskin. And initially that went really well. Some of the awards that you mentioned in my intro were for Brantwood. So I got the Emerging Writer Residency at Cove Park in Scotland. I got Creative Scotland funding. The Emerging Writer from Moniac Moore was for Brantwood as well. And the Lucy Cavendish shortlisting was for Brantwood. So I was absolutely convinced that this was going to go brilliantly and I was going to get an agent and a publishing deal. And I finished the book and I started to query agents. And I spent about a year doing this. I did get about half a dozen full manuscript requests, which kind of, kept my chin up a bit, but it was super painful experience. And I began to realise that actually this novel wasn't going to get picked up and that perhaps it wasn't finished, it wasn't ready. And I felt quite blue about it. You know how rejection is very difficult, especially as I'd had so much hope for it. So during lockdown, I just thought, okay, fine, I'm just going to write a novel for myself, something that I want to read, something that's maybe a bit crazy. It's just for me. I'm not going to worry about the market. And I started to write this novel about Julian of Norwich, which became For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain. And the experience of getting an agent and publisher was completely different. It was such a balm to my soul. I sent it out to a small number of agents once I'd finished it. It only took me about 9 months to write, whereas I've been working on Brantwood for quite a few years.
Wow.
I sent it out to 4 or 5 agents, and Sam Copeland at RCW got back to me on the same day saying, could I send the whole thing? Which I did, very excited. And the next day he offered me representation, which was like just extraordinarily exciting.
Wow.
Yeah, and I mean, it was RCW, like I didn't have to be asked twice. I was utterly thrilled. And then Sam sent it out quite quickly. He felt that it was already, quite extensively redrafted and edited. And I ended up having a 2-book auction and going with Bloomsbury.
Amazing.
And what was one of the best things for me is that Bloomsbury offered me a 2-book deal. And so they took on Brantwood, which was healed my broken heart.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
What a story.
That's what
Sounds like a movie.
I know, yeah.
It's like a romance, me and my book.
Finally reunited.
Having had a big break from Brantwood, I can see, that actually it wasn't ready to go out to agents. It's amazing how much difference it can make to have that big bit of time away. So I'm really enjoying the fact that I can now get stuck back into it, make it better, and know that it's actually going to be out there and find readers.
That's amazing. I think I spoke about this on the Rosie Andrews episode, that my friend was trying to get her debut published, and they were kind of at the point, her and her agent, where they were like, this debut probably isn't going to get its day, and then she found out yesterday that she's been offered a publishing deal, which is just amazing.
That's wonderful. And I feel like it's so much sweeter when you've had to deal with rejection and disappointment. It really 100%. Is so much sweeter. Yeah. Do
you have any advice for writers trying to get their first book published, maybe if it doesn't work out or anything? Do you have any advice for that?
I would say do what I did, really, and start something new. Just keep writing and keep trying to become the best writer you can, keep reading as much as you can, but also I think write what interests you. Don't worry too much about the market. You just can't second guess it, because publishing's so slow, and it's been 2 years since I signed my deal before the book actually comes out. So you just have no idea what, it might take you a couple of years to write, and then if you get a deal, it might be another couple of years where it's out. So you just have no idea what's going to be popular in 4 or 5 years time. So follow your heart. If you're really interested in a subject, and I think that enthusiasm will come through in the writing, and that'll be what wins readers over.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
I think as well, we've noticed a lot, we're talking to a lot more debut authors, that rejection is just as much a part of the experience, if not the predominant part of the experience, that all writers kind of have to go through.
Yeah, I think you'd be a very unusual writer to have no rejection. And even once you've got a book deal, these days it's quite a precarious career path. There's no guarantee that you'll then get another book deal. So if you do want to make it your career, something that you do for many years, I feel like you're risking rejection again and again as a writer. And you hear all sorts of stories of really established, prestigious writers. They could have written 8 or 9 successful books who then struggle to get another book published. It's pretty brutal. So yeah, I think you do have to accept that rejection is part of the process, and it's very, very difficult, but you just have to, persevere.
Absolutely. That's amazing advice. I'm going to put that on my wall.
Persevere, get through it. Well, as actors, we deal with rejection probably more than well. Your average Joe.
I can imagine. Yeah.
What I really wanted to speak to you about initially is the source material for the book. It clearly heavily influenced the narrative and the characters. My reading experience was fantastic, and I think a huge factor of that was what felt like the research was that went into the book. Can you tell us a bit more about like the source material's influence on your writing process?
Yeah, sure. So I really enjoy the research stage. I love truffling in books, finding all the kind of the juicy morsels. I really enjoyed doing sort of social history research, so finding out what people at that time ate, what they wore, what they did in their leisure time, that kind of thing. So the main source material were the books that my 2 main characters wrote themselves. So Revelations of Divine Love by Julian Norwich, and the Book of Margery Kempe by the great lady herself. These books are written in Middle English, and I'm not a medieval scholar, so I read them in translation in modern English. But I still felt that you could hear something of their different voices, their different personalities in these books. So I wanted to kind of, as a novelist, kind of fictionalizing them. Character's so important. There were certain character traits in the writing that I wanted to draw out even more for my own book. So with Julian, it's quite a plain theological text in some ways. She doesn't talk a huge amount about her life, her personal life. So for me as a novelist, that was a completely blank canvas. We don't really know that much about Julian of Norwich. And she took her name from the church where she was an anchoress, so we don't actually even know her real name. So I could invent a life for her, but nonetheless, her book was important in terms of constructing a voice for her. She's very calm, she's very contemplative, she's very reflective, she's quite serious in some ways. And it was initially Julian that interested me because I'm kind of obsessed with nuns. I love reading books about nuns. And initially I had thought that Julian of Norwich had been a nun. It was only once I started my research that I realised an anchoress is a bit different, very strict, very constricted life, living just in a single room. So that was what got me started. But once I started researching Julian, I very quickly came across Margery Kempe, who I think is probably slightly less well known. So I got the Book of Margery Kempe, which is her autobiography, as we'd call it. She didn't actually write it herself because she was probably illiterate, which was very common at that time. She dictated it to a few scribes. So again, there's a sort of issue there of, well, how close is it to her voice? She couldn't have read it over to check how close they were sticking to what she was actually saying. But nonetheless, I felt there was a character there that was very engaging for me. People have quite strong reactions to Margery, not always positive. But once I started reading this book, I was blown away by her voice. She's kind of garrulous, she's boastful, and she's always trying to show how she's better than her neighbours, how Jesus loves her more. She has this incredible relationship with Jesus where he's almost like this lover. She's always telling us how handsome he is. She has sort of these conversations that are very intimate with him. And I just thought it was wild. I loved it. I'd never read anything like it. And then thinking about juxtaposing that with Julian, who I said is, quite serious, quite theological, that was just so much fun as a writer to think, okay, I'm going to interweave these two women's voices. I'm going to kind of juxtapose their two approaches to their visions of Christ. Sometimes for slightly comic effect, you've got Julian's seriousness and then you cut to Margery just kind of being a bit crazy and rambling and complaining about things a lot. But what really mattered about Margery to me is I felt that despite all this boastfulness, to me there was something else there, something a bit lonely, a bit sad, a bit unfulfilled, and that she was using these visions of Jesus to comfort herself and getting comfort that she wasn't finding in her life, in her relationships. And I really like that idea of maybe the reader reading between the lines with Margery and thinking, okay, she's saying all this stuff, she's going to go to heaven, she's going to be the one sitting at Jesus's right hand side, she's not afraid of death. But actually there was sort of an irony there. You think, no, she is afraid of death and she is lonely. And so that was really fun to write. I have a huge soft spot for Margery Kempe.
I love Margery. I really do.
That is such a you character led.
And she's me.
I think a lot of people can identify with her, and a lot of people have mentioned wouldn't she be amazing on social media?
Oh my gosh, yes.
She'd be all over it. She really would. She'd be all over it. And she's, in kind of modern parlance, she's such an oversharer.
Yes. And my favorite moments of Margery were just the weeping. Weeping. It's just me. I would just cry all the time at nothing. And it's shut up. And I'm no.
But how unashamed she was to just wander the streets wailing.
Just a wail.
And everyone is just please be quiet. It's just no.
But I think there's another thing about that as well. It's just she's so brave.
Yes.
Because, you know, to say that you had visions of Jesus at this time was essentially heretical, and heresy was taken super seriously by the state and the church. You know, she risked being burnt at the stake. And she actually had a priest when she was younger who was taken to London and burnt for heretical views. So, you know, she'd have been well aware of the risk that she was taking. So yeah, she is hilarious, but she's also got this kind of steeliness to her. She's absolutely determined to talk about what she's seen. And so I do really admire her as well.
Oh yeah. And I think what you were saying before about imagine her on social media, like I think she'd have a big fan base. I really do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Be like Marmite.
Yeah. So obviously the style of the book is very unique, as we've said. But as we've just said about Margery, like I loved the insight into these characters' minds. You know, they were both very different, but I loved their individual voices. I particularly appreciated the later part in the book. I'm being very careful here of not revealing too much, but there's a later part in the book where dialogue is set out like a script, which I loved. What inspired your writing style?
It's hard to say. It was something that I didn't feel like conscious of, and I've looked back at my early drafts and it's there from the very beginning. First of all, the interweave monologue, so it's the first person. I wanted to really prioritize their voices rather than have it filtered through a narrator. And then the script at the end was there right from the very first draft as well. It's like I wanted to kind of strip away anything that was superfluous. And I almost imagined it. It's funny talking to you both because you're actors, but I sort of imagined it on stage.
Oh, yeah.
With these two women sort of spotlit, and the fact that they were speaking through a curtain at Julian's window, so they couldn't even see each other. So in a way, I didn't really want there to be anything for the reader to see either. I just wanted it to be all about hearing these voices and just putting all of the attention on the words that these two women were saying to each other. I was so excited when I realised that they had met when I started doing my research, because it wasn't something that I had known initially. So I was really just, as soon as I realised this, thinking, okay, I want to make the kind of focus, the climax of this novel. And then, yeah, I just wanted to imagine what these two women could possibly have had to say to each other, you know, living at similar time, similar visions in some ways, but utterly different personalities, utterly different lives. What did they make of each other? I just, as a novelist, I found that question of character fascinating.
Yeah, I found, you know, both characters really striking, and I loved that you mentioned theatre, because I can absolutely see it on stage. And you know, you've got two actors here, so
guess who's playing Margery? I
love you.
I love it. No, you both perfect.
Well, it's sorted.
Let's make this happen.
That's casted. Yeah, I can't actually count how many things we've got lined up now, Hannah, with the amount of photos.
I know.
They've told us we're cast. I'm sure it's like 10 now.
I'm still waiting for the contracts to come through, though.
Wait for the emails. Anyway, moving on from us. One of the things that I really loved about the novel was the way that you used religious imagery and dreams, and how they play like quite a fundamental part of both of the women's lives. Their visions particularly come to mind, and is it the shoeings? Is that how you say it? Shoeings?
Oh, so Julian writes it with an E. But I'm not a medieval expert. As far as I know, you just say showings.
Oh, right.
Yeah, but I could be completely wrong. But I say showings, and it's my book. So
okay,
you make the rules. You make the rules.
We're gonna go with you. I was like, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. But yeah, so they particularly come to mind when I think about when we're talking about that kind of religious imagery and dreams. How difficult was it as a writer to create those moments and choose what to include and at which point, and how much of it are we going to see from her perspective or their perspective? I found it fascinating. Could you let us know a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things that's so engaging about both of their books is how vividly they write about their visions, their showings. And I think at that time, it was very normal to be very physical and vivid, thinking about, for example, the suffering of Christ on the cross in a way that I think, makes some of us uncomfortable today. But, Julian is really dwelling on the fact that this is a human body that's suffering, and looking at close detail about the sort of desiccation of the skin or the wound in his ribs where he's been speared. And so one of the things that's so interesting to me, is the kind of physicality. It's not a kind of rarefied, abstract spirituality. It was very grounded in Jesus's body. And then with Margery, Jesus is like a pal, isn't he? I mean, he just comes down now and then when she's feeling, blue, it seems, and has a chat with her, and it's lovely. But then she has these other visions where she imagines herself into the biblical stories. So she imagines herself at the birth of Jesus. She's almost a midwife, helping Mary, swaddling him. And then she imagines herself at the death of Christ. And again, she's like comforting Mary. She makes her this like spicy hot drink afterwards. And it's sort of so banal, but it also makes it so real. And during doing my research, I found that Margery imagining herself into these stories wasn't actually unique. It seemed to me just so Margery, but actually it was quite a common thing for people to do in the medieval period. And it's called affective piety, and they like imagine themselves into the Bible stories. Yeah, it was really fun to write, I suppose, to kind of dwell on those physical details, to dwell on the things that that they drank or touched or smelt. So for me, it was a really interesting approach to religious ideas, and one, I suppose, I don't know, I always really like bringing together like the intellectual with the earthy. I hate the idea of like the ivory tower or whatever. I like thinking about intellectual ideas, but I'm also a woman and a human body, and that doesn't go away. And that was one of the things I got really excited about thinking about Julian in her cell, actually, because she becomes an anchoress to contemplate her showings, to live this very spiritual religious life. But I was just thinking, yeah, but you're still a body, you still have to defecate and eat and keep yourself clean. And this is this is a cold cell with an earth floor. There are going to be earwigs. It's going to be wood lice. And so I had a lot of fun kind of trying to bring together the idea of, okay, she's a mystic, but also she's a woman with a body and needs. So I really enjoyed kind of like smashing those two things together.
Yeah,
I love that she that Julian had the occasional cat, and that one winter a squirrel moves in and the cat's like, I'm out of here. I was like, yes.
I can't think that she mentions a cat in her book. I could be wrong. I can't remember a mention, but in recent, depictions of her paintings ever since, there's often a cat there. So I liked the idea that she had a cat. And then I suppose I have a cat too, and he's super grumpy. As most cats are. You don't really get cheerful cats, do you? So I sort of liked this idea that maybe he would take umbrage at the idea of these other creatures coming in. He'd get the huff.
And I think cats do tend to live quite a like solitary existence. They live amongst us peasants.
Absolutely. So they would be a great anchoresses, wouldn't they? I mean, 100%. And especially like they'd have a maid to kind of like bring them their food or bring them blankets. That's all they need.
I am my cat's maid. I am.
Yes.
You are.
It's a problem. So I have the first quote of the episode.
Can I just say this is a shock, because usually I'm getting told off because I'm like quote a minute.
And
it's Hannah turning up with a quote.
But I am a bit scared because we have a tendency to choose the same quotes that we love. So I'm a bit nervous. I'm sorry it's happening. I'm here first. So so my quote, if you don't mind me reading, it is spoken by Julian, and I'm going to say nothing more on that. As a young woman, every time I sat under the chancel arch in church, I had looked at the paintings of sinners being dragged by demons to the mouth of hell, where unfaithful wives were stripped and beaten, moneylenders roasted, and murderers boiled in oil. And I'd wondered why the Lord was so angry with us. I wondered how God could love us since we were such sinful creatures. And that is just the small bit that I just really loved. And I reread that specific paragraph about 5 times. Just the idea of, and I don't know if I've misinterpreted it, but just the idea of women being perceived as like sinful creatures. I just felt that the representation in this book of women of faith was just so powerful. And the representation of the treatment of women as well. It's obviously particularly poignant, which we see a lot through like their marital relationships and all that kind of stuff. What did you want to kind of interrogate about women and their relationship to God and the church in your book?
Oh, wow. I suppose, so I don't actually have any religious faith myself.
Oh, wow.
Which, yeah, it probably will surprise some readers. But I hate saying this in this like really abstract way. I've always been really interested in religion.
Mm-hmm.
And I really hope that doesn't come across as like condescending. Like a lot of people that are close to me are religious. And, you know, besides anything else, I think the major religions have so much effect on the way that we live, whether we're aware of it or now, in terms of like our legal and ethical systems, like the values that we have and so on, is so shaped by, you know, the history of religious thought, basically. So I just think it's really, you know, I'm interested in it and I think it's important. But then, so you've got sort of these theological questions that are explored in the book, and they're the sorts of questions that I like thinking about as well. So even though obviously the book's not autobiographical, as a novelist, you get to pour in all of the kind of random things that you like thinking about. And so I'm really interested in this idea of, you know, if God's omnipotent, then why do we sin? Because surely, you know, these sorts of like questions you go over in your mind as you grow up. Why are we allowed to sin in that case if God's in charge? So I've got these sort of abstract theological questions, but then there's also the question of the church as an institution, which for me is a very separate thing from wider theological questions. So I was sort of really keen in the novel to be very respectful of exploring religious faith, which I do have enormous respect for, but at the same time being critical of the church, which is a very human institution as far as I'm concerned, and is responsible for you know, a lot of poor treatment of women, a lot of the kind of patriarchal biases that we still live with, and that has done, you know, I'm not saying it's done no good, though I don't want to be getting hate mail here, but you know, it's clear that the church has done harm at times. So that I was sort of wanting to explore that kind of human aspect of the church, how an individual priest is not the same thing as a kind of religious ideal. You know, a priest is still a human person. So yes, I guess I wanted to sort of explore the treatment of women by the church in a way that is certainly far from positive, whilst also holding, you know, onto these theological ideas that really interest me and that I want to explore in a more sort of respectful, intellectual way. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it really astounds me. I mean, my friend Emma, who I need to stop mentioning on the podcast, but she is a playwright, and I was in her play Pure, which was kind of an interrogation of the treatment of women within the church. And she grew up in like a heavily religious environment, and you know, how much trauma, I guess, she's got as a result of that. You know, the way she was treated, the way women that she's friends with and that she knows from within the church, the way they were treated. And I think, you know, what you were just saying about patriarchal biases, like how that kind of affects the way that we live now, like it's just so true. And I think I'm just going to be throwing this book at her, like she's gonna absolutely love this. But I was so surprised that you're not religious yourself. I mean, I'm not, but I am interested, and I often ask my friend Emma about like her religious experiences because I find it so interesting. And it, you know, it influences the way that we live and our behaviors and our mindset towards things. So yeah, I'd find that fascinating because it feels really, really well researched. So I think you've absolutely done it justice, you know, regardless of whether you're religious or not.
That's great to hear. Yeah. It's tricky. And when I queried agents with it, when I queried Sam Copeland, who became my agent, one of the things I said in my query letter is, I know it's quite a theological novel for an agnostic to have written. Because it's sort of, I wanted to flag up that that I don't have a dog in the race, if you like, with religion. You know, I'm not trying to propagandize or anything. You know, I'm an interested outsider, I suppose.
And I think as well, what comes through, and I think this is why it would be a surprise to quite a lot of readers that you're not religious, is because both of the women's passion for their religion and love of their religion in its many forms, you write so well that you can't believe that you're not religious because they're so passionate about their faith. And I think that it just shows that your writing is just how great your writing is.
I was really conscious as well that at that time, you know, Catholicism was essentially the default. And there was the beginnings of kind of like the thoughts that then became Reformation ideas, with translating the Bible into English or questioning the role of priests, that kind of thing. But basically, for most people, they wouldn't have questioned it in the way that we do today, because we're surrounded by people who don't have religious belief or people of different religious beliefs. So it's something I think that we're much more self-conscious about now. So I was really concerned when I was writing to kind of enter their mindsets where it's just like, yes, we're Catholic, and we don't even think about it in a way, you know, but we certainly don't question or doubt it. That's just, I'm a human being, I'm a Catholic, you know. I wanted to make it this sense of that was simply their worldview, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's a fascinating look at their lives, and I feel like one aspect of their lives is touched upon really, really well, and that's motherhood. And that both of their relationships with motherhood, because it plays a different role in both of their lives. We see Julian suffer a loss of a child, and we see Margery have multitudes of children. Like I lost count. Like at one point it was like 12, then it's like 14. I'm like, what? This can't be anymore. But yeah, so we see those different kind of, that juxtaposition of their relationships with motherhood. What role do you think that motherhood had for the narrative overall?
I think it was a really important theme that I wanted to explore, absolutely. So in the book of Margery Kempe, she does mention that she has 14 children. So I was using that kind of fact, that nugget that she'd given us, and working with that. With Julian, as I said, we don't know anything about her personal life. So her family life is something that I invented with the child, and also I wanted to make her own relationship with her mother quite tender. So you know, she both is a mother and has a mother, and I wanted to juxtapose Margery's very traumatic experience of motherhood with something more positive, just to show a kind of range of experience. And I mean, it's my novel, so I should be convinced by it, but I find it very convincing that Julian would have had a child because of the way that she talks about God being a mother as well as a father. You know, it's something that's a really important part of Julian's theology, is this idea of God as a mother, and God is caring, God is who we turn to when we're in pain. And obviously, you know, those roles would have been more, well, they're quite fixed now, aren't they? But this sort of, you know, this the cliche that you turn to your mother when you hurt your knee kind of thing would have held true then. Yeah, so motherhood was really important. And there has been, you know, academics have speculated that Margery's visions were a result of postpartum psychosis. We don't know that, obviously. There wouldn't have been those sorts of ideas in circulation at that time necessarily, or certainly not couched in the terms we use. But also, I didn't want to explain away Margery's visions. So I've shown that she has a traumatic birth, and I've shown that the visions start, well, we know that they did start very soon after the birth of her first child, but I didn't want it to be sort of dismissed as cause and effect, You know, I wanted to still allow a space for the fact that perhaps these were perhaps she was simply a Christian mystic who had visions because, you know, God chose her. God thought she was special and sent his son to her to have these conversations. I was keen, I think, for both of them not to kind of close down explanations for these visions. And I also didn't want to suggest in any way that I didn't believe that they had visions. For me, that's like not an important question about whether or not they had them, whether or not, you know, they thought they had them or made them up or whatever. I really just wanted to take that at face value. Yeah, it just felt artistically like the right thing to do.
I think it's so interesting what you said about how people have suggested that Margery was in this postpartum psychosis because, you know, history loves to dismiss women having opinions. They've got opinions, so they must be mad.
Yeah, they must be mad. It must be a disease.
But also, you know, 14 labours with nothing to soothe them, like
you've got your rose oil, don't complain.
Don't you come at me, don't anybody come at me with rose oil. No, thank you. I was like my massive epidural needle and whatever visions come, they can come.
gosh, no, I can't even imagine it. I'm so concerned for Margery.
It's incredible, isn't it, that she survived given you know how dangerous childbirth was at that time. To go through it, I mean, at least 14 times. We don't know even if her children all survived or not. It was just really brutal.
I'm not a religious person, but I fully believe her that, you know, she believes that God is with her at all times, because he must have been for her to have survived all of that without help for pain, without pain relief. I just no. So I feel like there's so much that we could talk to you about, you know, about your writing of these women and the particular themes linked to them. You know, I feel like this is a really gritty feminist piece, which we obviously love, especially as feminism would have been like such a foreign concept during this period. How did you feel researching and writing about these women? Was it an empowering experience, or was it quite bleak maybe?
It wasn't that bleak actually, which might seem surprising given, you know, obviously women's lives were very constricted. Couple of things really surprised me when I was doing my research. So I've mentioned that I've mostly been working on Brantwood, which is about Ruskin. So most of my reading for a long time has been 19th century, and, you know, a lot of constriction there for women's lives. So going back, you know, 600 years from now, you'd expect it to be even more constricted, as if there was this sort of trajectory of women slowly being liberated. But that's not true. Medieval women actually have more autonomy, more power than I expected. And I don't want to overstate that, but just a couple of things surprised me. So I sort of indicate at one point that Margery works as an alewife. So she was brewing ale in her village and selling it. So women did actually have jobs and, you know, earned money, and that gave them a little bit of freedom and autonomy. And the other thing is that they could inherit, which they can't do hundreds of years later. So I have Julian inherit her mother's estate, and, you know, money is power. It's through having money that Julian can actually become an anchoress, because they were expected to pay their own way. So she signs everything over to the bishop. She expects the bishop to ask questions about her spiritual state to check that she's, you know, ready for the anchoress life, but actually all he's interested in is that she's got the cash to pay for it. But yeah, so in a way, the fact that she's inherited enables her to make that life choice. And then with Margery, she inherits from her father, and she's able to pay off her husband's debts, that he's got debts from bad business. And because she does her husband this big favour, this isn't in the novel, but afterwards Margery goes on these incredible pilgrimages around the world, which they come after she's met Julian. So it's after my novel. And she has her husband's permission to go on these pilgrimages. She goes to Venice, she goes to Jerusalem, she goes to Spain, because she's paid off his debt. So your money is power. And so these women do have a little bit of choice in their lives because they have this money. The other thing that just occurred to me to say as well is the anchoress life is clearly so restrictive, but I wanted to kind of explore that paradox of freedom for Julian, that it's only by becoming an anchoress that she has the freedom to think, to write, to contemplate her showings. And so it's this physical constriction that gives her this incredible mental freedom. And for me, that was like a really important part of exploring the anchoress experience. So we think of it as a kind of form of torture, I think, for most of us. But there were very few ways that a woman could live and have the opportunity to read and think and write, which are basically like the three things that I like to do. So, if I were to go back 600 years, I maybe consider becoming an anchoress.
And I wouldn't blame you.
And I'd be on the street weeping.
Yeah. But you could come and visit me and we'd chat through the curtains.
I would. I'd come and see you every day.
I would do my best to give you good counsel.
I can't stop thinking about Margery in a modern context, and I'm trying to guess if she'd be either like a travel influencer, or whether she would be a podcast host and it'd be like something like Boss Lady, or
why not both? Yeah,
that's true.
I mean, this might start like depressing everyone, because it's a bit depressing, because you know me, I love a bit of sadness.
The listeners know by now how much you love grief and death and all things related to it. So
guess what this quote's about?
Death and grief.
Basically, I just wanted to give the Bookends listening a feel for your writing and a feel for basically the time period. So I'm just going to read a little bit of the beginning, which I think encapsulate the kind of environment in which death and grief were they were basically everywhere. Mm-hmm. It was just part of life. And I find it fascinating. So I'll just read a little bit. When I was a child of 7 summers, a great pestilence came to our city. As the death carts went up and down the streets, the sound of their wheels and the horses' hooves mingled with the sounds of weeping. But there was little time for ceremony. Thump. The bodies were wrapped in whatever was to hand, sheets, tablecloths, rugs, and heaved onto the cart. I watched from an upstairs window, something both my mother and my nurse Joan had told me not to do. Thump. The cart trundled to the next house. Thump. Sometimes the covering came loose as a body hit the wooden planks, unravelling to reveal a chin or an ear. Oh, it's just, yes.
So visceral.
You're like, so visceral. I can only communicate through sounds. But yeah, so death and grief are huge factors in this book.
Stop saying it while you're smiling.
I can't. I know you can't put this on social media because everyone will know how crazy I am. But you have a wonderful way of including death for what it was at the time, which is this kind of general occurrence and everyday occurrence. How did you want to portray death and particularly grief with the women's experiences of grief through the lens of these characters?
I suppose so a couple of things. So when they lived, it was a time of like repeated plagues, and I was writing this during lockdown, so it was such a strange time to be writing in. And I don't want to kind of make heavy weather of the comparisons, but a writer inevitably draws on their own observations, their own experiences and thoughts. And there were things that I was thinking about or experiencing that I was able to draw on. So, one of the things Julian talks about in that section a little bit later is like how quiet the world became. And I think that was something that a lot of people experienced during lockdown. Like where I lived, suddenly there was so little traffic, so little footfall. A lot of the shops that weren't food shops were closed. And Julian's time was very much regulated by the ringing of bells, the church bells, because they didn't have clocks and watches. And a lot of bell ringers got the plague and died. And so there'd be moments when the bells wouldn't ring. And I just think that must have been one of the most haunting things, one of the most kind of really bringing home to people that there had been this mass death with plague, with just the silence, suddenly the bells not ringing. So yeah, there were these kind of strange parallels with our own time. But I think whenever I'm thinking about a period of history where there's a lot of death, I always really want to humanize it. I never believe that just because a woman may have given birth to, like 14 children and lost 7, say, I don't believe that she would have been blasé about that loss, you know. I really don't. I think she would have grieved just as much as I would grieve. And so I was really kind of keen to show that, like with Julian, how she was marked by the loss of siblings, parents, and then her own immediate family when she's older, and that wouldn't have been kind of something like, oh well, I, you know, just remarry or just have more kids, you know. I really wanted to make that more, to make it seem that, you know, I was thinking about how I would feel in that situation. And I really believe that people would have been just as devastated as we would today. Only I think it was Darwin lost a daughter to it. I can't remember the disease now. It was like one of the poxes or something. It was his daughter Annie, and you know, he had quite a few children, but he never got over Annie's death. It just because he had lots of kids didn't mean that, you know, he could somehow lose one and not care. So that, yeah, it was really important to kind of humanize that experience of loss and grief, and to make it feel, I suppose, contemporary in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, the death, just reading her talking about death, Julian, sorry, reading her talking about death and like the huge losses that she experiences. I'm not going to specify who.
I've probably given away too much.
But the losses that she experiences are just so like, it just really like moved me. And it's rare for me to cry at a book, but there were tears. So it's, yeah, I think it's crazy that we've gone from, you know, when we were being taught about the plague in school, we were just like, oh, such a foreign idea. And now we've all kind of lived through our own version of the plague. But to an extent, I guess, like, we're so much luckier and more privileged than these people would have been. You know, they would have been clueless as to how to kind of navigate this situation. And, you know, just the whole like bodies being lugged onto like carts and stuff, it is just such a haunting image. And I just think, yeah, how you've managed to make it feel so like current, but not at the same time. I'm really not articulating myself well here. It was just a really haunting image, the whole bodies being lugged onto the carts, and just the way you wrote death and grief are just so moving and poignant. And yeah, I loved it. So
yeah, and if that opening doesn't get you and make you stay, I don't know what will.
100%. So we've said before on the podcast that we have a sort of strange bias towards historical fiction, mainly because it can be quite dense and usually 1 million pages in length. And I have big book fear, so that's a problem. How did you manage to tackle so much in such a short novel?
That's a really hard question to answer. I don't know. It just came out like that.
I was reassured at the beginning of this when you said that you were always kind of unsure about writing novels because of the length.
Yes.
So I feel like we're on the same page here. Give me more of these short novels.
That is another thing that I put into my query letter to agents, as well as like saying, oh, this is theological, but I'm agnostic. The other thing was, you know, you have to write, I'm pleased to enclose my novel of blah, blah, blah words. And I was like, oh my God, it's 30,000. And, you know, every bit of writing advice you get is like, that's, you know, that's not acceptable. Don't go querying agents with a 30,000 word book, because
really,
yeah, absolutely. And so I wrote in my query letter 30,000 words brackets, no, that's not a typo. Just so to be really clear, this isn't, you know, 80,000 is quite typical for a novel. I thought, oh, what if they think I've just hit the 3 instead of the 8 by mistake? So I wanted to make it absolutely clear that this is theological and this is short. And if that doesn't appeal, then, you know, stop reading right now. That's fine. I
feel like shorter novels though are really having their moment. Like,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm here for it.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like, I think maybe because I started life as a poet, as it were, I'm sort of very into thinking about cutting cutting right down. Like when I was a student at St Andrews, we were taught by Don Patterson, a poet, and he would always say like, "Oh, bring me a sonnet and I'll tell you you've got a great couplet." So he'd want to, hack away most of it, or take him an epic and you'll end up with the sonnet. So I'm good at cutting, I think, because of that. But also I suppose I didn't quite think of it as a novel because it has these sort of weird bits in it. It's got these scripty bits, but also I make some use of sort of bit of like poetic formatting, and I've written a lot of short stories. So I was sort of the way that I was framing it, there isn't a lot of kind of there isn't much background, there isn't that kind of narrator's voice padding it out, telling you about the weather and setting the scene or anything. Any kind of description comes directly through what the characters are looking at. And in Margery's case, she's rarely looking at anything. So, most of the kind of natural world description or whatever comes from Julian. Yes, I don't know. There was something about the kind of the monologues being interwoven that just, it lent itself to being short.
I mean, I'm just really surprised that you've managed to write about so many different themes and to explore kind of so much in such a short amount of pages. I just think props to you as a writer, because it didn't feel like it didn't feel like anything was missing. It didn't feel like, there wasn't enough. I felt like,
it's that like ability. I think it's such a rare ability to be able to encapsulate such an amazing epic story in such a concise manner, and still you go away feeling like you've lived their whole liyou feel like you've been with them the whole way through. And
that is how I wanted to articulate that. Just
I know, darling. I
know. You are the mouth to my brain.
Literally, I don't have a brain. I've just got a mouth. That's all I am. But yeah, so talking about kind of discovering these characters, these people. What I really took away from the book was the importance of these women's writing and the impact that these unsung, really, in my opinion, historical figures have had on the history that we read about and the history we know and have learned about. I was really, really moved by the stories of these women. And I know that this is a fictionalized account of it, but I felt like in some way I got to touch upon their lives and to understand more about where women's place was at that time and what women were still achieving as opposed to what we were not achieving, which seems to be the narrative at the minute. What I wanted to ask was, how do you feel about the influence that these women and other female writers have had on you as a writer, and really as literature as a whole? That's a massive question, just so you know.
That is epic. I suppose one of the things that really I felt very strongly when I was writing it was a sense of how lucky we were to have these manuscripts, because they're incredibly unusual in several ways, but also just the horror of what must have been lost, because these are the earliest books that we have in English by women, but they can't have been the first. So you wonder just how much has been destroyed. And they're also unusual because, they're not women of noble birth. They're not even kind of like, abbesses who may have been literate and kept records and so on. These books are so unusual in that they are the records of the lives of very ordinary women. And that, well, apart from the fact, obviously, they're both mystics, so they're very extraordinary in that way. But in terms of like, their social class and their experience, we have so little about the women, that made up the kind of the bulk of society. And so it's a real privilege. It's really exciting, especially with Margery, who tells you quite a bit about her life, to have that insight. So incredibly important for the history of women's writing, just for the history of women, full stop, really. And these manuscripts, the fact that we have them is also extraordinary. We don't have the actual originals. What we have with Margery is that fabulous story where we had a few excerpts that were preserved from the 15th century, and it was assumed she was an anchoress, which, when you know Margery's personality, is actually quite a funny thought. But in the 1930s, there was this country house in Suffolk, some people playing ping pong. One of the guests trod on a ping pong ball. It's like an unbelievably Margery story. So they go to this cupboard to find a spare ping pong ball. They have this big rummage, a load of like old tatty books fall out. The owner of the house is like, oh, I'm going to chuck them all on the fire tomorrow. They're just getting in the way, you know, we need more ping pong balls in this cupboard. But one of the guests thinks, oh, hang on, you know, maybe these could be of interest. And it turns out to be a manuscript of the missing book of Margery Kempe. It's not the original, but it's 15th century, so it's very close to the time that she wrote it. And the fact that we have it is due to someone standing on a ping pong ball is so fluky. It's so chaotic that it really fits for Margery.
100%.
But you just think, well, what else is hanging out in cupboards and country houses, you know? Yeah, it's really remarkable that we have it. And then with Julian, again, we don't know where the original is. We don't know how her manuscript got out into the world. So, you know, my novel is kind of a fictionalization of what might have happened to her manuscript. We do know that some nuns in France made copies of it, and that these copies were taken back to England and kept safe by nuns. So her book's very much been something that's been precious to women and has been protected by women over the centuries, which also makes it really special. But yeah, we're so lucky to have them. Like, just, you know, fires destroyed so much, the Reformation destroyed so much, carelessness destroyed so much. It's really amazing that we've got the story of Julian's visions and Margery's visions, but also horrendous to think what might have been. What stories of women we might know that we don't.
Yeah.
But I also think as well that the writers like yourself retelling or, you know, recreating these people's lives, it gives them another chance to be discovered and another chance to be, you know, I'd have never have known about Margery and Julian without your novel. I'd have probably never come across it because it's just not my field of expertise or interest where I would naturally go to. But now I'm like, you know what, I'm so interested. I want to learn more about it. I want to know about more about their lives, about the experiences they had. And I think it's great that, you know, a modern novel can keep that alive, that's a story, you know, centuries old.
Well, that's brilliant. I suppose that's like, if, you know, anything comes of this book, that's what I would hope for, basically, to bring Margery and Julian to people who aren't already familiar, and to excite interest in their lives and in their works, and have people, you know, go and learn more about them, basically, because they are completely fascinating women who, yes, they deserve to be extremely famous.
Yeah, they really are fascinating women, and I loved being inside their minds I inhaled this novel in about 48 hours, but amazing. I would love to pick your brain about this book, you know, even more than we already have done, but I've just realised that we've kept you over time. So listeners, please get ordering For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain, which is an iconic title. I will be putting a link to order in the show notes. It is out on the 19th of January, which is so exciting. I can't wait for readers to be immersed in your amazing book. I'm just so excited to hear other people's thoughts on this. And I'm absolutely sending a copy to my friend. So yeah, really excited for her to read that. Can our listeners find you anywhere on social media, not in person?
No, I am on, I live in my Ankara cell, so you won't find me. But I'm on Twitter at For Thy Great Pain, and I've got a website as well. If you just Google Victoria MacKenzie, you will find me. And you can contact me through that as well.
Gorgeous. I will include all of that in the show notes. Before we let you go, as it's the debut series, we do also want to ask if there are any debut authors that you think should be on the radar of our listeners.
Yeah, I've got a couple I think I'd like to give a shout out to. So Aoife Fitzpatrick, her novel, her debut, The Redbird Sings, is out from Virago in April. It is I think it will be very much your cup of tea. It's historical. It's based on a true story. It's got these fantastically named characters in it as well, like Trout Shoe and Lucy Fry. It's absolutely gorgeously written. And it's very much about women trying to be independent and being put down. I'm desperately trying not to give any plot away, but it's very exciting. And it's really exquisitely written, like you want to read the sentences out loud. It's so beautiful, but it's also quite a tense thriller. It's amazing. So The Redbird Sings by Aoife Fitzpatrick. April 2023, definitely give a shout out to. The other book that springs to mind was a debut that was out in October last year, Orpheus Builds a Girl by Heather Parry, which was
yes, I have heard about this.
So it's completely different. It's also based on a true story, and it's quite gothic and gruesome. Again, I'm gonna massively try not to give too much away. It's also about women's bodies, power over women's bodies. I'm
sold.
Yeah.
Can I just say, I was sold at gothic and gruesome.
So. I knew you would be.
Yeah, Lydia, you'll love it. It's just death all the way.
We'll edit this bit out. Edit this bit out, please.
No, it's going on the socials, this. So obviously a huge shout out to Bloomsbury as well for making this episode happen. And obviously Bloomsbury are the publishers of your book and of your second book as well. When is the second book happening?
Well, it's supposed to come out in 2025. So
no, we can't wait that long. Sorry.
It's going to be very different, but hopefully it's interesting. But I'm still writing it, so it's still very much a work in progress.
I'm having words with Bloomsbury.
we're having words about that deadline, but also we would absolutely love to have you back on to talk about it when
that would be amazing. Very much up for that.
Lydia, did you want to ask anything finally?
Well, I'm just wondering if we had anything that you've watched recently, listened to recently that you've really loved.
Oh,
you're on the spot.
Yeah, gosh. So I just I'm always like, I'm never very good at like keeping up with the contemporary. I'm always like a little bit behind, so I just
too much to keep up with at this point.
Yeah, I find it stressful. Like, I haven't finished the 19th century yet. How am I supposed to be reading everything out in 2023? It's too much. I just got the new Kate Le Bon album, Pompeii, which is really beautiful, so I'm really enjoying that. God, watching, no, I'm way too much on the spot. I can't think. I mean, I just like rewatched The Wire. Honestly, I'm like hopeless. I like just watch things that are 20 years old.
I haven't watched The Wire.
The Wire is incredible. You must. Oh my God, The Wire.
Call myself an actor.
No, come on. You can't even. You know for a fact the amount of times you didn't even know who Bruce Willis was.
I did. I just couldn't think of his name on the spot. Thank you.
She worries me, honestly.
Don't shame me on the podcast.
Also, have you watched Four Weddings and a Funeral?
No.
No, you have not.
No, I have not.
No, Victoria, I believe that you would have. I believe that you would. Yeah. Because everybody has. Apart from Hannah.
So that's all we've got time for today, guys. If you enjoyed this episode and Lydia shaming me, please do rate, review and subscribe, as it helps to boost us in the charts. You can follow us and more of our mischief at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. For people that aren't very technical, I don't know how we have so many different social medias, but here we are. Please do go follow those. And links in the show notes to Victoria's wonderful book, which, as I said, is out on the 19th of January. And you want to be ordering this one because it's incredible. But thank you so much, Victoria, for joining us today. This has been amazing.
Thank you for having me. I had a blast. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.